The Edo Corporation was founded in September of 1925 by Earl D. Osborne. And the reason for the name of Edo was he went to his mother originally to borrow the money, and she was a Phelps Dodge wealthy individual. And she decided she did not want her name connected with aviation, which in that days was a pretty sporting industry. So what she did is she finally agreed to supply him with the money if he used only the company's initials. So that's the reason for EDO, which became a well-known company. The pictures you're looking at are about the mid-30s, 1937, and these are early photographs of the Edo manufacturing operation located on Flushing Bay across from LaGuardia Airport. If you'll note, there's a large seaplane ramp, and in fact, Edo used the seaplane ramp to launch most of its aircraft, including the famous Lindbergh flight that went to China. This photograph is of a Buell Air sedan, model CA6, and is installed on Edo.G 5300 floats. Note that it is a bi-wing aircraft, and it's believed that this photograph is in the late 20s or early 30s. The Waco CPF was built for the Brazilian Navy, and it's got a Wright 250 horsepower engine, and it's an Edo model 45-2800 float. This photograph is of a Curtiss Wright Gypsy Moth, and we're not quite sure where the name came from, but we believe that Curtiss might have built some of these under a license from de Havilland. The airplane is shown on an Edo model 1525, and the individual standing on the float is George Post, who was the first sales manager for the Edo Corporation. There is not much information available on this aircraft, and it is believed to be a Vultee V-1A with a Cyclone engine. It must be quite a large airplane because it's installed on an Edo 65-9225 float, which means it probably was an airplane in excess of 10,000 pounds gross weight. This is a very interesting set of pictures, and it shows a famous White Russian called Alexander D. Seversky. And the first photograph is sitting in the cockpit of the Golden Server Sky. D. Seversky was a White Russian who actually had a wooden leg. And when the aircraft was being built at the Edo factory, he would actually stop at different workstations in the plant and borrow an oil oil squirt gun to lubricate his leg, and then he would roll down his pants and go back to work. The installation had an adjustable float to change the angle of incidence between the float and the airframe. This made for a very fast aircraft. The Seversky aircraft would become the prototype of the Diversky Aircraft Corporation. The aircraft was the P-35, which was the forerunner of the famous aircraft P-47, which was built Republic Aircraft. One of the interesting things about this photograph, this set of photographs, if you look carefully, there's actually 5 wheels in the photograph. And what would happen was, when he put it in a landing configuration, the rear of the float had a little wheel, and there was also a tail wheel on the airplane. So when he actually landed, there were 5 wheels on the airplane. The other interesting part of the story is he talked Corbin into building the airplane, and you can see in these photographs some of the big jigs and stuff that we built. And he didn't have too much money, so we would work on the airplane for a while, and then when we used up all his money, Corbin would have the airplane lifted to the ceiling of the factory. And when D. Seversky came around to see how the airplane was coming, he would sit him down in his office, and he would hand the check to a runner who would run the check into town to see if the check was any good. And then he would call back to the corporation, and somebody in the corporation would tell the factory workers to lower it down on the floor, and everybody would go to work on it to make them think that the airplane had been worked on the full time. We're not exactly sure of the number, but we believe 9 or 10 of these were built, and a few were sold to the Colombian Air Force, and it is rumored that 1 or 2 of these were in the Franco War in 1938 or 39. At the beginning of the Second World War, the Japanese had a large number of seaplanes that were quite useful when they were invading the different islands. And the U.S. government, the Navy, in fact, came to Edo and asked us to install the Grumman Wildcat. And this is a photograph of the Grumman Wildcat FA4-350 with a Pratt & Whitney 1,200 horsepower engine and Edo Model 6560 floats. And the airplane was put together and flown. Because of the horsepower and the small tail area, it was not a successful airplane. It had major stability. So only one of these was ever built, and it did not meet the requirements of the Navy, and so the aircraft never went into production as a seaplane. Okay, this is a Northrop N-3P that had a Wright 1100 engine and was installed on Edo 67 9000 floats. In the late 30s, the Northrop received a contract from the government of Finland to develop this aircraft for patrol of the extensive coastal areas. Only a small quantity were ever built, and by the time the aircraft was ready for delivery, the government of Finland had been overrun by the Germans, and therefore the airplane was never delivered to the Germans. A small flight of these, 4 or 5 of these, were ferried to England, and on the way, they used Iceland as a fueling spot, and one somehow had a mishap in the river. I don't believe it was a landing or takeoff accident, but they had a big current, and it was sunk in the river. And in the late 1980s, a crew went back in and salvaged it, and the aircraft was rebuilt in the 1990s into perfect condition and was returned by the Northrop Company to Finland, and it is in a museum to this day, and it certainly would be worth going to see if anybody ever has the opportunity. And this was a Beech Air 18 that was developed for the, I believe, the U.S. Navy in the late 40s, and this Beech 18 had a Jacobs 285 and was later replaced with a Wright 320 engine. It was originally installed on the Edo Model 55-7170s, and later installed on a larger float, a 7650. The original installation was done for the Air Force, and later the FAA approval was obtained. And at one time, almost 100 Beech 18s on floats were operating in North America, and a few are still operating along the border up around International Falls. One of the interesting part of this photograph is in the background is a picture of the old ferry slip that used to go between the Bronx and College Point before the Whitestone Bridge was completed. This is an interesting picture of some of the work that Edo did during the Second World War on developing rescue equipment. We made a life raft, a lifeboat that was dropped from the B-29, and this picture is actually a rescue cell that was used on the Curtiss Seahawk SC-1. Most of the airplanes were built in Columbus, Ohio, and I was able to talk to Mr. Dan Patarini, who was at Edo at that time and worked on this project. Originally, the floats on the Seahawk had 2 bomb bays in them, and they used to carry bombs, and that didn't prove very successful, and they later went and put fuel tanks in this. And this rescue cell, actually clipped onto the armament racks under the wing, and we believe it had a little drop-down ladder. So if it would see a pilot down the water, they would land, and the pilot would climb into the cell, close the door, and they would fly him home. This was done in probably 1944 and 1945. The first major contract of any significance Edo received in the late 30s for the Navy boat Kingfisher. And the first picture we're seeing is of the main float, which is 68-9860. And it also had 2 small wingtip floats that were rather small, and their number is 68-750. Before the project was done, we built over 1,500 of these floats, and they were used extensively by the U.S. Navy. One of the more famous people we rescued was Eddie Rickenbacker, and Edo got an E award during the Second World War when the airplane spotted Rickenbacker and I believe 4 people in the water. and they were in such bad shape they could barely pick them out of the water. And they had this was a two-place airplane, and they had 4 people they picked out of the water, so they now had 6 total. And they put the people, they tied the people, they put Rickenbacker in the fuselage, in the co-pilot seat, and tied everybody else on the wing, and they taxied for over 24 hours in very rough seas to get these people to a rescue ship. Okay, these are interesting shots in a number of ways. Number one, it shows you the type of jigs that Edo manufactured to build these floats. And the picture in this case is the 249-2870 that later became the 628-2960. It was used primarily on the Cessna 180 and 185. Edo is famous for developing a method of softening the skins, the forward stretch skins, the compound skins. And here's an example. The skins were put into a heat treat oven, and then they were stored in dry ice. And then they were put on a stretch block that was about 20 feet long, and a machine that was 20 feet long, and they'd pull these and beat these, and that would develop that compound curve. As you can see here, they're putting the rivets in the bottom skin, and then once the airplane comes out of that jig, then the top assembly goes on. This is a photograph of the original C-47 that was put on Edo model 78-29,000 floats. This is an amphibious float, and it's the largest float ever built by Edo. The float is 42 feet long, 5 feet wide, and 5 feet high, and had internal fuel cells that could hold 325 gallons of fuel in each float. The aircraft had hydraulic water rudder steering. The prototype was put together at the American Airlines facility at LaGuardia Airport, and all other float installations were done at the Douglas factory in Oklahoma City. The original contract was for 150 sets, but only 36 were manufactured before World War II ended, and the contract was canceled. It is believed that 12 to 13 sets were installed on the C-47, and they saw service in Alaska, the Philippines, New Guinea, and they were used primarily for medical evacuation in the Pacific Theater. There is only one set of these floats left in the world, and is installed on a DC-3 in Greenville, Maine, and is currently owned by Folsom Aviation. This is a picture of the Cessna L-19 on the Edo 339-2250 float. This was built in the mid-50s, and it was done for the U.S. Army. And a requirement was originally for an observation aircraft that could operate off water. The original float installation was on straight floats 44-2425 and later on the 248-2440. The L-19 amphibious model, I believe, was done for the U.S. Air Force, and there were at least 25 sets of the amphibious version built. This photograph details an effort of Edo in the late 40s to develop a lower price float that would have less labor in it. The actual float that's detailed in the picture is a 92-1400. And if you'll note, it's a 3-seam float. All the old floats you've looked at in the past were 5 seams, and this one has 3 seams basically consisting of the keel and the chines, and then the top skin is a wraparound across the top. After this float was completed, we went on to the Edo 89-2000 float, of which over 2,500 sets were made, and is really the standard for most of the early Piper aircraft. This is a photograph of the Edo model 597-2790, which was developed from the Edo 289-2700. The 2700 was the first amphibious float that we had on the Cessna 180, and as the Cessna 180 grew into a 185, they needed a larger displacement float to meet the higher gross weight. This photograph is in the late 50s, and it is at Edo College Point with the ramp in the background. Some of those employees that are in that photograph I personally know, and they had been with Edo for over 40 years. The Edo Corporation went on to become primarily a military contractor, and is well known for its sonar its sleds, and its bomb racks that it went on to produce. The corporation sold the float operation to Kenmore Air Harbor in Seattle, who has kept manufacturing the floats today. And Ito is now currently owned by IT&T.